The drive back from Boston should have taken 3 hours. It took 3 hours and 22 minutes because Toby insisted we stop at a gas station outside of Plymouth so he could get a cherry Slurpee, the big one, the kind that turns your tongue red for the rest of the day. He was grinning the whole way home, that gap-toothed grin he'd had since losing his front tooth back in April, chattering about whether his baseball cards had stayed safe while we were gone, whether Grandma Evelyn had remembered to keep his window cracked the way he liked it. I told him of course she had. I told him everything was fine. I was wrong. My name is Audrey Miller. I am 34 years old, and I am a freelance interior designer, living in Edgartown, on Martha's Vineyard, one of those salt-aired, shingled-roof towns on the Massachusetts coast, where old money runs quiet and deep and everybody knows everybody's business before they know it themselves. 2 years ago, I lost my husband, David. And since that gray November morning, when the hospital called every single decision I have made, every client I have taken, every dollar I have saved, every night I have stayed up past midnight finishing a project proposal has been for one reason only: to keep our son Toby safe inside the life David and I built for him. Our home, Highland Cottage, was not just a house. It was a white-shingled, green-shuttered piece of New England history, sitting 3 blocks from Edgartown Harbor, with creaking floorboards and a garden full of wild black-eyed Susans that David had planted the summer before Toby was born. It was the place where David used to sit at the old oak desk in Toby's room every Sunday evening, reading box scores aloud like they were bedtime stories. It was the place where Toby still pressed his small hand against the side of that desk, sometimes when he thought I wasn't watching, as if he could still feel the warmth of his father through the grain of the wood. When Toby and I turned onto our street that Sunday evening, the late summer light was doing that golden thing it does over the harbor in August, long and warm and honey-colored, spilling across the rooftops like something out of a painting. Toby had his cherry Slurpee balanced on his knee and was telling me about a rookie card he wanted to add to his collection. Then we walked through the front door of Highland Cottage, and the world stopped making sense. The hallway smelled wrong, too clean, too empty, like a room that had been scrubbed of everything that had ever lived inside it. Toby went quiet mid-sentence. He felt it too, that absence, that wrongness hanging in the air like a held breath. We walked down the hall together, and I saw at the door to Toby's bedroom, standing wide open, the afternoon light falling across 4 completely bare walls. His bed was gone. The cedar frame bed David had built with his own hands the winter before Toby was born gone. The antique oak desk is gone. The framed jersey on the wall. The carefully organized binders of vintage cards. The small blue lamp shaped like a lighthouse that Toby had picked out himself at a shop on Circuit Avenue, all of it gone, as if it had never existed at all. Standing in the center of those bare floorboards, holding a thick stack of cash, and wearing a smile that made my stomach drop straight to the floor, was my younger sister Chloe. Chloe Mitchell was 26 years old and 4 months pregnant, and she was standing in the middle of my son's stripped bedroom like she had just won something. She had kept our mother's last name when I took David's, a small distinction that had never seemed to matter until now. She had David's old desk chair, the one I had never been able to bring myself to throw away, pushed into the corner, and she was leaning against the bare wall with a stack of bills fanned out between her fingers, flicking through them the way people do when they want you to see the money before they say a word. Her dark hair was pulled back, her belly just starting to show beneath a yellow sundress, and she was smiling at me with the kind of smile that made the back of my neck go cold. "Hey, sis," she said. "How was Boston?" I could not speak. My throat had closed around whatever I was trying to say, and all I could do was stand in the doorway of my son's room and look at those 4 bare walls, the hooks where his framed jersey used to hang, the pale rectangular shadow on the hardwood where his cedar bed had stood, the empty corner where the oak desk had lived for 9 years. Toby's hand found mine. His small fingers curled around my palm and squeezed so hard it hurt, and I heard him make a sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something broken and bewildered, that a 9-year-old boy should never have to make. "Where is my stuff?" he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word. "Mom, where is all my stuff?" Before I could answer, Chloe tilted her head and let out a short laugh, bright and careless, the kind of laugh that expects no consequences. "I cleared it out," she announced, spreading her hands wide, as if she were presenting a finished renovation. Sold it all online, ran a little garage sale Thursday morning. Got a decent price too, considering most of it was just old junk. She paused, looking around the empty room with obvious satisfaction. This is going to be the nursery. I was thinking of a sage green on the walls, maybe a white glider in that corner. The room tilted. I put one hand against the doorframe to steady myself because my legs had gone strange and distant beneath me, like they belonged to someone else. You sold his things, I said. My own voice sounded far away to me, flat and stripped down like a wire with the coating burned off. You sold my son's belongings. Oh, come on, Audrey. Chloe rolled her eyes and tucked the cash into the front pocket of her sundress. It was a kid's bedroom. A mattress, some old clothes, a bunch of dusty cards. Nothing irreplaceable. That was when my mother appeared in the hallway behind me. Evelyn Mitchell was 60 years old with silver-streaked hair. She kept pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and the kind of calm, practiced expression that had always made her arguments feel like conclusions. She was wearing her good cardigan, the cream-colored one she saved for company, and she put her hand gently on my shoulder as if she were consoling me at a funeral she had organized herself. Audrey, sweetheart, she said, her voice low and reasonable. Chloe is having a baby. She needs space, she needs a proper room to bring a child home to. You have to understand that. I turned to look at her. My chest was so tight I could feel my own heartbeat pressing against my ribs like it was trying to get out. She went into Toby's room, I said carefully, while we were gone, and she sold everything in it. She sold some furniture, yes. My mother's expression didn't waver. And the money will help her get set up properly. Single mothers have to support each other, Audrey. That's what family does. Toby made a sound beside me that broke something open in my chest. He had started to cry, not the loud, theatrical crying of a child throwing a tantrum, but the deep, gasping, helpless kind that comes from a place too genuine to perform. His shoulders were shaking. His face was pressed against my arm, and I could feel the wet warmth of his tears soaking through my sleeve. Mom, he managed between ragged breaths, his voice muffled against my jacket. Mom, did they take Dad's stuff too? The cards Dad gave me, did they take those? I pressed my lips together so hard they went numb. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders and pulled him against me, and I held him there while I looked at my sister and really looked at her for one long, steady moment. Chloe met my eyes without flinching. She actually smiled a little wider, as if my composure were a concession she had already won. I did not scream. I did not throw a single word at her that I would regret. I simply tightened my arm around Toby's shoulders, turned away from the empty room and the bare walls, and my mother's reasonable cardigan, and walked straight back down the hallway toward the front door. Audrey, my mother's voice followed me, sharpening at the edges. Audrey, we are not finished talking about this. Yes, I said without turning around, without slowing down, without giving either of them the satisfaction of watching my face. We are. The front door of Highland Cottage clicked shut behind us. The evening air hit me with salt and cut grass, and the faint faraway smell of the harbor, and I stood on the front step for exactly 3 seconds, breathing it in before I picked up Toby's hand and started walking. Chloe was still counting her money. My mother was already planning what color to paint the walls. Neither of them had any idea what they had just set in motion. The Harbor View Hotel sat at the top of North Water Street, 4 blocks from Highland Cottage, close enough that on a clear night you could see the glow of our porch light from the 3rd-floor window. I had driven past it 100 times without ever thinking I would need it. I booked us into room 214, 2 queen beds, a small writing desk, a balcony that looked out over Edgartown Harbor, and I carried Toby's bag in while he walked beside me with his head down and his cherry Slurpee still clutched in one hand, mostly melted now, the red bleeding pale and watery through the plastic cup. I did not finish it. He set it on the nightstand, curled up on top of the covers with his shoes still on, and was asleep within minutes. The deep, exhausted sleep of a child whose body had decided it cannot hold any more of the day. I stood over him for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, and then I pressed 2 fingers very gently against his cheek, the same way David used to do every night before turning off the light. My hand was trembling. I walked to the small desk by the window, pulled out the notepad the hotel had left beside the telephone, and sat down. Outside, the harbor lights were doing their slow, quiet shimmer across the dark water, and somewhere down on Dock Street, a group of late summer tourists were laughing about something, their voices carrying up through the warm August air like they belonged to a completely different world. I uncapped the pen. I started to write. The antique oak desk, David's desk, the one his grandfather had built by hand in a workshop in Concord sometime in the 1940s, had a hidden compartment. Most people would never find it. It was not a drawer, not a latch, not anything obvious. It was a recessed panel set, flush into the underside of the third drawer, accessible only if you knew to press inward on the lower left corner of the drawer's back wall until you felt the soft click of the magnetic catch releasing. David had shown it to me the week after we moved into Highland Cottage, holding a small flashlight between his teeth and grinning like a boy who had just discovered buried treasure. "This is where I keep the things that matter most," he had told me, his voice hushed and conspiratorial in the empty room. "Nobody finds this unless you show them." Inside that compartment, sealed in 3 professional-grade protective cases, were the cards. Not a single card, but a collection David had spent 11 years assembling piece by piece. 41 cards from the 1952 Topps set, each authenticated and graded by professional sports authenticator, including a Mickey Mantle rookie in PSA 3 condition, and 17 additional high-number series cards that had become increasingly rare in any grade. David had tracked them down one at a time through auction houses and estate sales, and a few very lucky finds at card shows in Providence and New Bedford. The last independent appraisal, conducted 14 months before he died, had valued the collection in its entirety at just over $26,000. Also inside that compartment, tucked behind the card cases in a flat velvet pouch, was a key. A small brass key that opened the cedar box I kept on the top shelf of my own closet, the box that held my grandmother's jewelry. I had moved the box itself into the desk's hidden compartment the morning I left for Boston, because the safe in my bedroom had been sent out for repair 3 days earlier, and I had not wanted to leave $42,000 worth of gold and uncut gemstones sitting on an open shelf while the house was occupied by people I had, in my worst mistake of judgment, trusted. I set the pen down. $52,000 in jewelry, $26,000 in certified sports cards. The oak desk itself, an authenticated antique, was worth another $8,000 at minimum. I picked the pen back up and kept writing line by line, item by item, until the total at the bottom of the page read $78,000. Chloe had sold all of it for $1,800. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I got up, walked into the bathroom, ran the cold tap, and pressed both hands flat against the edge of the sink. My reflection looked back at me from the mirror, eyes dry, jaw set, expression perfectly composed, and for exactly 30 seconds I let the composure go. My shoulders dropped. My breath came out in a long, shuddering exhale that I had been holding since the moment I had seen those 4 bare walls. I let myself feel the full weight of it, the violation of it, the cruelty of it, the image of Toby's face when he had asked about his father's cards. 30 seconds. Then I straightened up, ran cold water over my wrists, and went back to the desk. At 8 o'clock the following morning, I called Harrison Vance. Harrison had been David's attorney for 12 years, a quietly formidable man, out of a Boston firm, the kind of lawyer who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He answered on the second ring. "Audrey," he said, "I've been expecting you to call." I told him everything. When I finished, there was a brief pause, not uncertainty, just the careful silence of a man organizing what he was about to say. "All right," Harrison said. "Here is what you need to understand. Highland Cottage is held entirely within the David Miller Family Trust. As sole trustee, you have complete legal authority over every asset within that trust, the property, the structure, and every item of personal property inside it. Your mother and your sister have no ownership interest whatsoever. They are permissive guests, meaning they reside there at your discretion and can be removed at any time. What Chloe did entering Toby's room, removing trust property, and selling it constitutes grand larceny under Massachusetts law. Given the documented value, we are looking at a felony charge. I pressed the phone against my ear and stared out at the harbor. I don't want to move yet, I said. If I send a cease and desist today, she'll try to hide the money or claim it was a misunderstanding. I want to wait until she spent every dollar and left a trail wide enough to follow. Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a sound instinct, Audrey. Document everything. I'll begin preparing the trust documentation and the eviction filing. When you're ready, we move all at once." I thanked him and ended the call. Then I looked over at Toby, still asleep in the morning light, one arm thrown over his face the way David used to sleep, and I made myself a promise so quiet and so certain that it felt less like a decision and more like a fact. They would not get away with this. Not one single piece of it. 4 days is a long time to wait when every hour feels like pressure building behind glass. I spent those 4 days in room 214 working from my laptop during the day while Toby watched baseball reruns on the hotel television and ate room service grilled cheese sandwiches that he said were not as good as mine, but ate anyway every last bite. I enrolled him in a 2-week sailing day camp at the Edgartown Yacht Club. Something to give his hands and his attention. Something to do. Something to pull him out of the hollow, faraway look that had settled into his eyes since Sunday. In the evenings, I sat on the balcony after he fell asleep and watched the harbor lights and thought about David. I thought about the way David used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was act before they were ready. He had said it about business, about arguments, about everything. Wait until they show you exactly who they are, he used to say. Then you'll know exactly what to do. Chloe had spent 4 days showing me exactly who she was. By Wednesday, Harrison had sent me the transaction records he had subpoenaed from her Facebook Marketplace account. 14 separate listings posted between Monday morning and Tuesday night, each one with photographs, prices, and buyer usernames. The Bugatti Stalker stroller she had ordered online on Monday afternoon. The custom nursery furniture set delivered Thursday. The spa weekend deposit charged to the same debit card that had received the Venmo payments from the garage sale buyers. Every dollar accounted for. Every dollar is gone. On Thursday evening, my mother hosted a dinner party at Highland Cottage. I knew because Mrs. Calloway, our neighbor, 3 houses down, a warm-faced woman in her 60s who had brought us soup every week for a month after David died, had texted me that afternoon to say she had seen cars filling the driveway since 5 o'clock. I thanked her, set my phone down, and opened the closet where I had hung the charcoal wrap dress I had brought from Boston. I got dressed slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you are preparing for something that requires your full attention. I picked up the black leather briefcase Harrison had couriered over that morning, checked that both documents were inside, and called a cab. The dining room of Highland Cottage smelled like roasted chicken and candle wax and the expensive perfume my mother saved for occasions she considered important. The table had been extended to seat 12, and every seat was filled. Cousins and aunt and uncle from the Cape, 2 of my mother's friends from her garden club, and at the far end, sitting beside Chloe with his jacket still buttoned, and a glass of red wine held loosely in one hand, was Julian Whitmore. I had met Julian twice before. He was 31, tall, with dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, in a way that made him look more distinguished than he had any right to at his age. His family had been in Boston since before the Revolution, the kind of family that had a building named after them, at a university, and never mentioned it. He was courteous in the particular considered way of people who have been raised to treat politeness as a form of discipline. When I walked into the dining room, he was the first person who stood up. Chloe was not. Chloe lifted her wine glass, non-alcoholic. I noted a small mercy and smiled at me with the bright theatrical warmth of someone who has already decided how this scene ends. "Audrey," she said, drawing my name out like it was a punchline she had been saving. "You actually came. I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would," I replied. I set the briefcase on the floor beside an empty chair, sat down, and accepted the glass of water my mother poured for me without comment. Around the table, conversation resumed in the careful, slightly elevated way it does when people sense something unspoken in the room but have decided collectively to pretend otherwise. Julian watched me for a moment with an expression I could not quite read, not unfriendly, not warm, just precise and attentive, and then returned to his wine. I waited until the main course had been served. Then I set down my fork, folded my hands on the table, and looked directly at my sister. "Chloe," I said, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to resolve this." The table went quiet. Not all at once, conversations dropped away in overlapping waves like dominoes tipping until the only sound was the candles and the distant water. Chloe set her glass down slowly, her eyes narrowing with something between amusement and irritation. "Resolve what exactly?" "You removed $78,000 worth of documented trust property from this house and sold it for $1,800 at an unannounced garage sale," I said, keeping my voice at the exact same volume as a normal dinner conversation. "You have 24 hours to either return every item in the condition you took it or transfer $78,000 into the escrow account Harrison Vance will provide you. That's the offer. It won't be made again." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Chloe laughed, a real laugh, loud and genuine and utterly without fear, the laugh of someone who has genuinely not yet understood what is happening to them. She turned to Julian as if sharing a joke and then back to me, shaking her head. $78,000, she repeated, tasting the number like it was absurd. "For a wooden desk and some old baseball cards. Audrey, do you hear yourself right now? The cards are PSA graded and independently appraised," I said. "The jewelry alone is valued at $52,000. I have documentation for every item." My mother set her fork down with a small, decisive click. "Audrey, stop this. You're embarrassing yourself in front of everyone. Chloe spent that money. It's done. The nursery furniture has already been delivered. You need to accept that this is how things are now and move forward like an adult." I looked at my mother for a long moment, long enough that she shifted slightly in her chair. Then I reached down, unzipped the briefcase, and removed two documents. The first was a certified copy of the police report I had filed that morning at the Edgartown Police Department, documenting grand larceny and unlawful removal of trust property totaling $78,000. I placed it directly on Chloe's dinner plate. The second was the formal notice to quit, the first step in the summary process, eviction, under Massachusetts law, initiating the removal of Chloe and Evelyn from Highland Cottage as permissive guests of the David Miller Family Trust, effective immediately. I slid it across the table to my mother. Chloe looked down at the document on her plate. The laugh died on her face so completely, so instantly, that it was like watching a light switch off. Her hand moved toward it, then stopped. Across the table, Julian set his wineglass down very carefully and picked up his own copy of the police report I had brought for him too, because I believed he deserved to know, and began to read. My mother's face had gone the color of old chalk. I zipped the briefcase shut, pushed back my chair, and stood. "The 24-hour window starts now," I said. "Harrison's contact information is on the bottom of both documents." I nodded once to the table, to the cousins and the aunt and uncle and the garden club friends, who were all staring at their plates or their hands or some fixed point on the wall, and then I walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, and out the front door of Highland Cottage for the second time in 4 days. Behind me, I heard Chloe's voice rise sharp and cracking at the edges, the first real fear in it, calling my name. I kept walking. Detective Carl Ramos called at 7:48 on Friday morning, while I was sitting on the balcony of room 214 with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and the harbor turning silver in the early light below. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice the particular kind of unhurriedness that comes from decades of delivering difficult information to people who are not ready for it. "I've reviewed the documentation Mr. Vance forwarded to us yesterday evening. The transaction logs from your sister's Facebook Marketplace account are extensive, and the Venmo records are even cleaner. She photographed every item before listing it, time-stamped every sale, and accepted payment directly into an account registered under her legal name." He paused. "She was not careful at all." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. "What happens now?" "We reach out to the buyers," he said. "Under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 266, anyone who purchases property they know or have reason to know is stolen can be charged with receiving stolen property. That's a felony if the value exceeds $1,200. Once we make that clear to your sister's buyers, they tend to become very cooperative very quickly." Howe was right. By Thursday of the following week, every single buyer had contacted the Edgartown Police Department voluntarily. The antique oak desk, disassembled and loaded into a pickup truck by a man in Tisbury who had paid $200 for it, was the first item returned. The PSA-graded card cases came back next, still sealed, carried in by a retired schoolteacher from Oak Bluffs, who had bought them at the garage sale thinking they were a set of old postcards and had not yet opened the cases. My grandmother's jewelry box was recovered from a woman in Vineyard Haven who had purchased it for $80, examined the contents, and immediately called the police herself upon realizing what she was holding. One by one, everything came home. 3 weeks after the dinner party on the last Saturday of August, Chloe hosted her baby shower in the back garden of Highland Cottage. I knew about it because the eviction proceedings were still working through the Dukes County court system. Summary process takes time, and Harrison had warned me it would be 2 to 3 months before a judge issued the formal removal order, which meant Chloe and my mother were still technically in residence. I had moved into a furnished short-term rental on Pease's Point Way, 2 streets over, which suited me well enough. I could see the top of Highland Cottage's roofline from my kitchen window every morning. The garden had been decorated with the particular extravagance of someone spending money that did not belong to them. White linen tablecloths, arrangements of pale pink peonies in tall glass vases, a champagne tower sparkling cider at Chloe's end, and a 3-tiered cake with hand-piped flowers that must have cost $400 at minimum. 60 guests, according to Mrs. Calloway, who had texted me a photograph of the catering van pulling up that morning with the slightly apologetic tone of someone who knows they are delivering bad news. Julian's family had come down from Boston for the occasion. His mother, Eleanor Whitmore, a woman I had heard described as formidable, and found upon the 2 occasions I had met her to be precisely, that was seated at the head of the guest table in an ivory blazer and a double strand of pearls presiding over the afternoon, with the composed authority of someone accustomed to defining the social temperature of any room she entered. Detective Ramos had called me that morning to let me know the arrest warrant had been signed by a Dukes County judge and would be executed that afternoon. I thanked him, put on my shoes, and went to pick Toby up from his sailing camp. I was not there when it happened. I did not need to be. By every account I heard afterward, and in a town the size of Edgartown, accounts travel fast and arrive completely. It happened like this. The garden was at its most beautiful. At 4 in the afternoon, the August light going long and golden across the peonies, the champagne tower catching it in prismatic flashes, Chloe laughing at something Julian had said with the full-throated ease of a woman who believed entirely and without reservation that her life was exactly on track. Eleanor Whitmore was pouring herself a second glass. The gift table was nearly full. Then the side gate opened. Detective Ramos came through first in plain clothes, his badge on his belt. 2 uniformed officers from the Edgartown Police Department followed him in. The music stopped. The laughter stopped. 60 people turned to look, and the garden went so quiet that you could hear the harbor wind moving through the peony arrangements. Ramos walked directly to Chloe. "Ms. Chloe Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "I have a warrant for your arrest signed this morning by a Dukes County Superior Court judge on charges of grand larceny and unlawful sale of trust property valued at $78,000. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Chloe's face did not register the words immediately. There was a delay of 2 full seconds during which she continued to smile, as if her nervous system had simply refused to process what was happening. Then the color left her face so completely and so fast that Julian reached out and put a hand on her arm, steadying her. "Chloe," his voice was very low. "What is he talking about?" She opened her mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. Her hands were shaking so badly that the sparkling cider in her glass began to tremble visibly, small ripples moving across the surface. "Julian, I can explain," she started. "Ms. Mitchell." Detective Ramos stepped forward. "Please place your hands behind your back." Julian took a step back. He looked at the detective, then at Chloe, and his expression shifted not to anger, not to contempt, but to something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The particular look of a man watching something he had believed in dissolve in real time. His jaw tightened. "Is it true?" he asked her directly. His voice did not waver. Did you steal from your nephew a 9-year-old boy who lost his father? Chloe's eyes filled with tears. Her mouth worked. No words came. That silence was his answer. Julian reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed a small ring box. I learned later, through Julian's mother Eleanor, that he had brought it to exchange Chloe's original engagement band for a resized and upgraded version, a quiet private surprise he had planned to give her after the last guests had gone home. Instead, he set it very carefully on the gift table, the velvet lid still closed, and did not look at it again. Then he turned to his mother, who had risen from her chair with her pearls and her ivory blazer, and an expression of absolute Arctic stillness, and said simply, "We're leaving." Eleanor Whitmore set down her champagne glass, nodded once, and followed her son through the garden gate without looking back. Behind them, Chloe was crying openly now, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body as the officers moved to secure her hands, calling Julian's name over and over into the warm August air, while 60 guests stood frozen among the peonies in the champagne tower and the three-tiered cake watching everything fall apart. The knocking started at 11:17. I know the exact time because I had been lying awake in the dark of room 214 watching the red digits of the bedside clock, listening to Toby breathe in the other bed, that slow, even rhythm that meant he was deep under somewhere unreachable when the sound came. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 3 more, then a long, unbroken sequence that had stopped knocking and started being something closer to desperation. I pulled on my cardigan, crossed the room, and looked through the peephole. My mother was standing in the hallway in her cream cardigan, the same one she had worn to the dinner party, with her silver hair coming loose from its pins, and her eyes swollen and nearly shut from crying. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her look. She looked like a woman who had just watched everything she had constructed come apart in a single afternoon, which was, of course, exactly what she was. I opened the door. "Audrey." Her voice broke on the second syllable of my name, cracking open like something that had been held under pressure for too long. She reached for my hands and gripped them with both of hers, her fingers cold and trembling against my palms. "Audrey, please, please listen to me." "I'm listening," I said. She came in. I did not invite her to sit, and she did not ask. She stood in the center of the room with her arms wrapped around herself, her whole body shaking with the kind of deep, uncontrollable trembling that has nothing to do with temperature, and she talked. She talked about Chloe, about how frightened she was about the baby, about what a criminal record would do to a young woman's life, about how Chloe had always been impulsive, but had never meant real harm, had never understood the full weight of what she was doing. She talked about the family name, about the shame of it, about the neighbors and the friends, and the garden club women who had been sitting at that table, and would be talking about this for years. She cried through most of it. Not the quiet, dignified tears of the woman I had watched preside over my husband's funeral with composed grace, but ragged, gasping, red-faced crying that aged her 10 years and made her look, for the first time in my memory, genuinely lost. I let her finish. I stood by the window with my arms at my sides, and I let her say everything she had come to say, every word of it, without interrupting once. When she finally went quiet, breathing hard, her hands pressed against her mouth, I said, "Do you remember what Toby asked me, Mom, when we were standing in his empty room?" She blinked. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Audrey, he asked me if they had taken his dad's stuff too," I said. "He was 9 years old and he was standing in a room that had been stripped bare, and what he was most afraid of was losing the last pieces of his father. And you were standing right there." I paused. "You were standing right there and you laughed." My mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Her hands dropped from her mouth. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not guilt exactly, not shame exactly, but something beneath both of those things, something rawer and harder to name. "I didn't think," she started. "No," I said gently. "You didn't. And neither did Chloe. And that is exactly the problem." I walked to the door and held it open. "I love you, Mom," I said. "But I will not withdraw the charges and I will not stop the eviction. What happens next is the consequence of a choice you both made. I hope you'll use the time ahead of you to think carefully about that." She stood there for a long moment, looking at me across the small hotel room, with Toby asleep in the background, his chest rising and falling in that slow, unknowing rhythm. Then she walked out. I closed the door quietly behind her and stood with my hand flat against the wood for a moment, feeling the solid weight of it before I went back to bed. 2 months later, the Dukes County Court issued the formal removal order. Harrison called me on the Tuesday morning to confirm what we had both known was coming. Chloe's plea agreement had been finalized the previous Friday: 3 years of formal probation, 250 hours of community service, and a structured restitution plan that would require her to make monthly payments toward our documented legal fees and property costs for the foreseeable future. With Julian gone and her credit rating in pieces, she had taken a night shift position at a grocery store in Falmouth to meet her obligations. My mother had signed a lease on a one-bedroom apartment in a complex off the highway in Barnstable, 40 minutes from Edgartown, a long way from the harbor. I changed the locks on Highland Cottage on a Wednesday afternoon, standing on the front step in the September sun while a locksmith worked through the deadbolts one by one. That weekend, Toby and I restored his room. We spent Friday evening at a hardware store in Vineyard Haven. Toby holding paint swatches up to the fluorescent lights, with the seriousness of someone making a genuinely important decision. He chose Benjamin Moore Hale Navy, a deep rich blue that he said looked like the harbor right before a storm, which he meant as a compliment. We painted on Saturday morning, just the two of us, with an old playlist of David's on the portable speaker, and painted on our elbows by 9 o'clock. The antique oak desk had been carefully transported back by Detective Ramos's team and now stood in its original corner, the surface refinished slightly from its time away, but otherwise unchanged. I watched Toby run his hand along this edge of it, while the paint dried, a slow, deliberate stroke, the way you touch something you thought you had lost. The card cases went back into their display stand. The lighthouse lamp went back on the nightstand. The framed jersey went back on the wall, hung at the same angle David had always kept it, which Toby had memorized without ever being asked to. On Sunday afternoon, when everything was back in its place, I stood in the doorway and called him in. Toby walked into his room slowly, the way children do when they are trying to hold a moment still. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the navy blue walls, the familiar desk, the cards in their cases, the lighthouse lamp casting its small, warm circle of light. Then he walked straight to the oak desk, pressed both palms flat against the surface, leaned forward and breathed in. He stayed like that for a long moment. Then he turned to look at me, and his eyes were bright and full, right on the edge of something. "Mom," he said softly, "it smells like Dad." My throat closed around everything I wanted to say. I crossed the room in 3 steps, pulled him against me, and held him there in the middle of his restored room, while the afternoon light came through the window in long golden bars across the navy blue walls, and the harbor wind moved through the garden outside, and for the first time in 2 months, maybe longer, I felt the tight locked thing in my chest begin very slowly to open. Highland Cottage was ours again. Every corner of it, every creaking floorboard, every wild black-eyed Susan in the garden. Every carefully placed piece of a life that David had built for us and trusted me to protect. I had protected it. And I would keep protecting it for as long as Toby needed me to. I have thought a great deal in the months since that Sunday evening about what it means to protect someone you love. Not the dramatic version of protection, not the raised voice, not the slammed door, not the satisfying cinematic moment of telling someone exactly what you think of them while they stand there speechless. That kind of protection feels good for about 30 seconds. I know because I have imagined it many times. What I actually did felt like nothing at all in the moment. Picking up a small hand, walking out a door, sitting down at a desk in a quiet hotel room, and writing a list by lamplight while the harbor moved in the dark outside the window. But that is what real protection looks like most of the time. It is unglamorous, and it is slow, and it requires you to hold yourself very still when every instinct you have is telling you to burn something down. David understood that. He had built that understanding into the structure of our lives long before I needed it, into a family trust, into a hidden compartment in an old oak desk, into the careful, loving architecture of a home designed to keep standing even after he was gone. I believe with everything I have that God placed that wisdom in him for exactly this reason. That God knew what was coming before either of us did, and made sure that when it arrived, Toby and I would have what we needed to face it. I am not a person who believes that justice always arrives on time. I have known too much loss for that kind of certainty. But I do believe that when you act with patience and with truth, when you refuse to become the thing you are fighting against, God has a way of making the path forward visible one careful step at a time. That is not a lesson I learned from a book. That is a lesson I learned sitting alone in room 214 of the Harbor View Hotel at 2 in the morning, watching my son sleep, writing down the value of everything that had been taken from him, and deciding that I was not going to let grief make me reckless. What Chloe and my mother did was wrong. It was wrong in every sense, morally, legally, humanly wrong. They reached into a child's world and stripped it bare for convenience and for gain, and they laughed while they did it. I will not pretend that does not still live inside me somewhere in a quiet, guarded place. But I also know that carrying it as anger would cost me more than it would ever cost them. And so I have chosen slowly and imperfectly to set it down. Not because they deserved forgiveness that is between them and God, but because Toby deserves a mother who is present and whole, not one consumed by a wound she refuses to let close. Hi is doing well, my boy. He is 10 now, gap-toothed grin, mostly grown in, still devoted to his baseball cards with a seriousness that would have made his father laugh out loud. Last Sunday evening, I found him sitting at the oak desk with a magnifying glass and a price guide carefully cataloging each card in the tops. 1952. Set the way David had taught him to his handwriting, small and deliberate, in the notebook beside him. He did not hear me come in. I stood in the doorway of his navy blue room for a long moment, watching the lamplight fall across his bent head, and I thought this. This is what we were protecting. Not the cards, not the jewelry, not the desk. This boy in this light is doing this quiet and particular thing that connects him to his father. This is what we won. If you are sitting with something similar right now, a betrayal that came from inside your own family, a loss that feels too large and too close to fight a moment where the people who were supposed to protect you chose themselves instead, I want you to know that the stillness you feel is not weakness. The patience you are holding is not surrender. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pick up the hand of the person you are protecting, walk out the door, and trust that God will handle the rest. He did for us, in ways I could not have planned or predicted or forced into being. One careful, quiet step at a time. If this story reached you today, I hope it gave you something worth holding on to. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. And if you would like to stay for more stories like this one, please subscribe. There are more to come, and I would love for you to be here for them. Thank you for listening, and thank you more than I can say for caring about Toby's story.